Hello, and welcome to the Love Life, Live Life Fitness podcast, the premier podcast where we talk about topics ranging from health and fitness, performance and sport, and wellness and rehabilitation. We tie these topics together to understand their impact on our daily lives and our journey to be the best version of ourselves. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy today's episode. Hello, and welcome to today's episode. Today, we would like to welcome Brad. Brad, thank you for coming on, and feel free if you want to go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Angelo, it's an absolute pleasure to be on your show and stuff like that. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's always an honor and privilege to hit the podcast circuit and talk about what it is that we do. And for your audience, so I invented an exercise product called ISOPHIT. So it's a motion restraint device that focuses on isometric exercise, which is basically learning how to contract muscle without moving. So literally, I invented a fancy wall that you can put in the middle of a room that makes pushing into something simple. Because to be honest, nobody really wants to push into a wall when they're exercising. So that's really what it was. And somehow we're now in 50 countries. And we have over 1,100 of the coolest clients, and if I look at the brand value of just the sport organizations that we supply and work with, we just broke $120 billion worth of brand value, like their brand value, not my brand value, but their stuff. So I'm very, very fortunate in the sense that I get to work with some of the world's elite sort of sport performance professionals virtually daily, and we're chronically increasing, our, basically our customer count. So every day we add some new and unique and interesting opportunities, which is, to be honest, pretty phenomenal. So very, very fortunate and blessed in that sense. So
That's awesome. Right now, with your company, would you mind telling us a little bit more about your company and kind of how you got to that point of creating your company?
Oh, it was a virtually out of necessity. So came up with the original concept of ISOPHIT, basically in the bottom of my bathtub. So I had two clients walk in one day and they said, "Hey, Brad, there's no wall space at my gym to do isometric exercise." And if you go to a gym, you look around, they usually have mirrors on the wall, you got equipment pushed up against the wall, or it's literally a hallway for throughway traffic. So there's really no space to actually go pull into a wall, especially also to lie down to do hip flexion with adduction and abduction. So there was really no areas that they could do it. So I came up with that idea in the bottom of my bathtub, as I said. And that was back in 2008. And fortunate in the sense that I was, as a personal trainer, my network of clients were such that I was just around people that could help drive that project forward. So one of my customers was one of the senior partners in Canada's largest law firms. So I was talking to him about patenting this process and everything like that. Then one of my other clients, she was a student in a graphic design program. So she did all the original drawings for the ISOPHIT originally. So it's like you have somebody in senior law helping me with the high-end stuff. And then you have somebody who's just starting their career helping me actually craft that message so I could actually talk to the guy in the senior position. So it was pretty remarkable. So went through the whole design process, and that took about from 2008 to 2013. We were looking at different variations of the product. And then we finally came up with the original sort of ISOPHIT, which was basically a elevated platform off the ground, 12 inches off the ground. We went through a 30-inch platform before, where it was looking more like a therapeutic table. But we found if we want to do any standing isometrics, you can't have somebody stand on a 30-inch platform because now they're too high. Now they get the sort of kinesiophobia about falling when standing on a single leg 30 inches off the ground, which is pretty unique. Also, you run into height issues. So the whole sort of design thing was pretty crazy. Then we moved that from the platform. We went straight to the ground. Well, that sucked because it was difficult to move. And it was difficult to get on. So we put casters on so you could roll the wheel, like roll the table. And now when people stood on it, it would vibrate. So now all of a sudden you're like basically an isometric environment standing on a power plate, like one of those shake platforms. So that wasn't good for what we wanted. So just the product evolution was crazy. And then we formed the company in basically in 2013. And it's been a unique nightmare ever since. How I would describe it. Every day is uniquely different. We wake up, we have some, great things in manufacturing going on. Then we'll have things with shipping issues, and we ship globally. So we run, like today, as example, I had a customer call me. He's like, "Hey, we paid for duty, and it's out of Belgium. We paid for duty 2.5 weeks ago. It's still sitting in customs. Is there any way that we can get, speed this along?" So then I have to reach out to my shipping company. They then have to phone, the shipping company they deal with. So it's like, there's 4 or 5 layers to get an answer that takes hours when the customer just wants their product. It's something they paid for, and his business partner, who also got one, got his 3 weeks ago. And they're shipped out literally on the same day. So it's like, you look at things like that where it's just like, why? So you deal with frustrating things like that in business. And then, as we were talking about, this before we jumped on the podcast, just looking at things like quality control and, how somebody in Arizona might be using ISOPHIT and talking to their customer base about it. And then, somebody in Connecticut might be talking something uniquely different. So us as a company, we're in a transition phase from going from being a product company and a product focused company to basically transitioning into an educational company, because we have to worry about the consumer experience, the customer experience, the outcome of said customer. Because I have many years of saying, oh, isometrics are great. These are the reasons why. But if that's not being conveyed to the customer, if that's not being, the product's not being used in the way that I would use it to elicit said response, well, that customer experience, they feel like they were duped. And the consumer, like I was talking to a lady this morning, they make $45,000 a year, with ISOPHIT. I was talking to a guy in Connecticut who makes over $1 million with ISOPHIT. So where's the disconnect? Where's the discrepancy? And it comes back to education. And it comes back to, the gentleman in Connecticut brought me in to learn how we educate our customers, how we train our staff, how we actually promote isometric exercise, which is uniquely different than promoting dynamic exercise, right? Dynamic exercise sells on its own because it's been around for 50 years. Most people, they've heard about isometrics, but they don't implement it. They don't know how to sell it. And you're obviously a highly educated individual finishing off their PhD. And it's like, you think about how much education you've had on isometrics over the course of your educational career. It's not much, and it's like, okay, we got to pick up that slack. Now, part of the beautiful thing is we're now talking to educational programs in the United States. We have Texas Tech, one of the universities that have just picked us up. They're looking at teaching ISOPHIT in their university programs, which I think blows my mind. It's absolutely fantastic that we went from an idea in the bottom of a bathtub to now we have $120 billion worth of pro teams using our product to being taught at university programs now. I never in a million years would I have ever thought that journey was going to be the journey I'm on. So, but here I am.
Yeah, no, that's big. And I mean, all starting from a bathtub. And if you think about kind of where you've come from and all the conversations, again, people who are in completely different sides of the country and completely different sides of the world using your product and, the positive gains that they've had for their companies and organizations compared to some organizations and businesses who are still progressing in that way. How would you say your education and your career path, as you were describing that you were a personal trainer, how would you say that has helped you, as well as those nuances of learning the business side, marketing, and those conversations? How would you say education has benefited you, and how would you say the things that you have to learn along the process of becoming an owner of a company?
Oh, the education side and being a personal trainer. So the beautiful thing about being a personal trainer, so let's talk about that first. You gain access to individuals that otherwise you may never have access to. Even as a young trainer, as I said, I was working with one of Canada's senior partners in one of the top law firms. So he was coming to me as a client. So we have access to him, and he was a friend because I'm looking after his health and well-being. And then you have, one of my customers. He's one of the professors at MIT, right? So arguably one of the world's smartest universities on the planet. And he's coming to me for advice. Now, this is subsequently later in life, after we brought out the product. But throughout my entire career, I've always been able to work with highly educated individuals that provide me access to different insights. Like when I was a young trainer, I worked with a lady. She was probably one of Canada's, and more so Toronto's, top interior designers. So I was reading design magazines so I could, like fashion and housing and all that sort of stuff, so I can actually have a conversation with her. And then I would be dealing with a lawyer, so I'd apply to a law journal. So I'd be listening and learning about law so I could have a conversation with him. So just access to that information, and also having the understanding I needed to be of value to the customer, where it wasn't just about sets and reps. And it was basically, we're looking at how can I basically provide value for that customer. And then from that point, being able to sort of look at it from an interest perspective. The educational side, like I went to school for cardiovascular rehabilitation. The program was called Fitness and Lifestyles Management. So a 2-year program that I turned into a 3-year program because I wanted to redo the first year, because I was a young kid in Toronto going, I'm out too often, and basically I had to redo the first year. Again, just to, I sort of passed the first year. However, I didn't pass it with enough information where it was like dealing with, I wanted to redo it because my foundation was crap, to be honest. And going into second year, I wouldn't have done very well. So I was very fortunate to be able to redo the first year. From that point, getting that foundation of cardiovascular rehabilitation and everything like that, I found out that I had hypertension issues. I was 19 years old. So I'm a 19-year-old kid. I'm in shape and all that, and I got hypertension issues. So I then go on a path of, graduate school, dealing with hypertension, learn about a fabulous program out of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, called the Resistance Training Specialist Program. And this is about exercise mechanics. So this is now, I'm graduated when I'm 21, learning about this program when I'm 28 years old. So there's a 7-year window there where still dealing with hypertension, running a successful personal training business, but then heard about this program and it was like, mechanics of exercise. I don't even know what that means. And I went to school for 3 years for it. And it's like, okay, so then went down this path, signed up for this, RTS program. And the gentleman who was facilitating that was a guy named Tom Purvis. He was the pitch man for Bowflex. You would have seen him on TV every night for, 16 years, I think he did it for. But arguably one of the smartest guys within the industry when it comes to exercise, the application of exercise. And, Tom, he, pick an equipment manufacturing company. He's basically worked for all of them from a consulting perspective. So basically getting that insights. And then I also did a designation called muscle activation techniques, which is a form of manual therapy. And, a quick little synopsis of that. It's a way that you sort of assess muscle dysfunction. So, does the muscle actually fire on demand or not? So it's a systematic approach at identifying and correcting muscle imbalance that relates to impaired function. So I did both of those designations simultaneously and became the 21st person in the world with my designations. And the people that were in those programs at that stage were some of the industry's elite. Like now, if I look back, like Lauren Landau, who's got the Landau Performance Institute out in Denver. He's the head strength and conditioning for Notre Dame, the Fighting Irish football program. He was sitting beside me at the table. So those are those people where it's like, as you grow, it's like, oh my God, the expectation and the knowledge gained just by being around some of the world's elite trainers and performance coaches. So we had like Lauren over there. Then there was a guy named Chris Graney, who's worked with a ton of elite sort of professional athletes, like Odell Beckham Jr., was one of his private customers, if you will. And then on this over here, we had Kurt McIntyre, and Kurt McIntyre used to work with this kid named Shaun White, right, who is the Snowboard X Games king. So just once again, just having access to those minds was just invaluable, right? So you never know who you're going to be sitting beside in a course. And I'm like a firm believer in furthering your education well beyond what you can learn in your college program, because that's all foundational. Then you hit the real world and it's like, oh, but we didn't look at this scenario. So now you got to go down this deep dive. And for me, and the reason I got so heavily involved into isometrics was I went to school for cardiovascular rehabilitation, and they told me that I had hypertension, and they told me not to do isometrics or it would increase my likelihood of a stroke or heart attack. So I avoided isometrics for myself, but in muscle activation, we're using it for basically neuromuscular reeducation to help elicit a neural connection to a muscle. So that was kind of cool, but it's like, so I was using it with my customers, not myself. And then in 2007, I heard about a study from McMaster University, which is a local-based university around where I live. And they sort of said isometrics is good for lowering blood pressure. And that was the first I'd ever heard of it. And I'm like, well, that's BS. I went to school for this, and they told me not to do isometrics. And now you're telling me it's as good as a single pharmaceutical agent for lowering blood pressure? Well, I think I'm going to try this. So after 14 years of dealing with hypertension, 2 weeks later, my blood pressure was normalized by implementing a 20-minute per day isometric protocol, right? So it's like, oh, okay. There's something to this. So I went on this, like, I don't know, that was 2007. I'm still not done reading research on isometrics. I probably read 3 studies already this morning on the subject area, just because there's so much information on it that you can look at it from intra-brain communication and like dealing with individuals with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, MS. Like, how does your brain communicate one side to the next? We can have an effect on that. We can deal with obviously the sport performance side, right? So we deal with the world's elite athletes. So it's like, how do we increase, when we're dealing with elite athletes, we might be looking at cutting off 1/10 of a second. Like, how do we make them perform at that level where 1/10 of a second actually matters? But the difference might be the difference between hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars and coming 10th and being not even known. So in that sense, it matters. So the educational side is, oh, wow, it's so vital and it's necessary. And education can be deemed like, how do you talk to your consumer? Like, how are you actually going to sell yourself? So having the education of that to being a subject area expert on something nobody talks about, or being able to talk about the dynamic exercise side, because that's my past. Like, I own an 11,000 square foot gym in Toronto that most people don't even know I talk about dynamic exercise. But yet one of my businesses is that where we, have a membership-based gym. So how do you position that? Now, I subsequently don't have much involvement in that business anymore, just because everything I do with ISOPHIT. But it's like, how do you work on brand messaging where you don't dilute the brand to aid in confusion from a message perspective? So, yeah, so education is vital. And as I mentioned, we're rolling into an education company. So that's how important it is.
That's awesome. And that's amazing. I think that's very crucial, having that experience, not only owning like other businesses such as your gym, but with ISOPHIT, and seeing how that can be leveraged in the sense that you're working with not only, elite performance in different aspects and different age groups, but also all the way to certain chronic conditions in terms of rehabilitative settings. So right now, for your own self, how would you say your own education? I know you're saying you're reading a couple articles this morning, but would you say that your own educational interests are you leaning more toward like performance or more rehabilitative? How would you describe that in your own sense?
Man, I go on Google Scholar every day and hit isometrics and pick a subject area. So I will read virtually anything on the subject of isometrics, just because of the conversations I have daily. I don't know who I'm going to be talking to. But I like to sort of be well versed in a wide array of subjects. So it comes back to, I probably put more effort into the performance side right now, just because that's how our brand is positioned, where we're going after the elite athletes. Just because a couple of years ago, I consistently, like literally daily, multiple times a day, people would sort of say, what athletes are using your product? And if I couldn't answer it, people didn't care. If the sport teams aren't using it, obviously it's not good enough. So I basically took a strategic decision and said, okay, well, I'm going to pivot our company that was focused primarily on like the rehab type setting. And we totally switched the gears and went after the sport performance side. And a lot of people, they like to take isometrics, which is not moving, and learning how to contract a muscle without movement, and sort of say we're going to work with elite athletes who are the biggest and best movers on the planet. I mean, that was a challenging, transition initially. And then once you learn how to message it, right, because the transitional phase of all joint motion is isometric, right? You have to zero velocity going in your original direction, and then you have to reaccelerate going out of that. So once you're able to captivate that, well, now I can work with the world's elite athletes very fast, right? Because they're worried about transition times in force production. So how do I sort of run at a guy, and if it's a football player, how do I sort of, basically cut and pivot and get around that sort of tackler? Well, that comes back to how rapidly you can upregulate isometric tension. Now it happens at a thousandth of a second, but it happens in a thousandth of a second. And in a time interval perspective, you and I might think that that's actually pretty short, but to the nerve firing, well, it wasn't very short at all. So it's just about understanding what are we comparing this to? And often we think about dynamic exercise and dynamic movement. We forget that some area of the body has to stabilize that joint isometrically to allow the motion to occur in the first place, right? And then if we even take it one step further, let's take the NFL as example. Every play starts isometrically. So how do these players get off the line faster? So can we actually, whether it's an offensive lineman, can we get him a thousandth of a second faster, a tenth of a second faster off the block? So all of a sudden he's going to prevent the tackle or the sack, or he's going to engage his tackling, scheme better. So all of that stuff matters. So we were able to sort of strategically and easily, to be honest, get into the sport world, where it's like, oh my God, we didn't even think about this, or tendon health has become really popular lately, right? Most people don't recognize there's over 4,000 tendons in the human body that are responsible for transmitting force from muscle to create movement of the bone or to prevent movement of the bone. So all of those things, once you get the audience, and all you have to do is, have that conversation, and you see the aha moment go to the person that's listening, right? Because I have such a breadth of knowledge associated with human performance to the healthcare side, I can seamlessly go between conversations depending on, am I talking to a medical practitioner? Am I talking to a performance coach? So having those skills matter, but that just comes back to the volume of knowledge that I've, read. And it always comes back to the researchers out there doing it. So to all the researchers, thank you, because without you guys, I don't have the information. So it's my area of interest is just helping humans, at the end of the day. And it doesn't matter, are you in a wheelchair? Did you just have a stroke? Or are you looking to, break Usain Bolt's 100-meter record? I work with all three of those people, and consult with all of those people, which is unbelievably awesome, to be honest.
Awesome. That's amazing. And I think having those interests, even just, looking on Google Scholar and just typing in isometrics and just, having your way of where you want to go, I think that's credit to you for continuing your education and knowledge in that way and just kind of staying up on the literature. I was also going to say, in terms of that, how would you say with isometrics, we were talking a little bit beforehand in starting the podcast, we were talking about, say, like pushing isometrics and holding isometrics, as well as there's terms such as like rate of force development, how much force you can produce in the shortest amount of time. Would you mind just kind of describing a little bit about, pushing isometrics and holding isometrics and kind of how your product really kind of can be able to do that?
Yeah. So one of the things, so traditionally in the world of isometrics, if you go back far enough, there used to be a thing called yielding and overcoming. So yielding would have been like that holding, like I'm just trying to prevent something from moving. So that now, as the scientific community has come on board, we've now turned that from yielding isometrics to now they're calling it basically a HEMA, or a holding isometric muscle action, right? So one of those, and that's basically like you pick up a dumbbell and hold it in space, or hold a split lunge or your body weight for a period of time. So that's what that is. Overcoming isometrics, which is now known as PEMA, which is pushing isometric muscle action, or pulling isometric muscle action, is where you're basically shoving into an immovable object with the goal of moving said object, or upregulating your tension at a specific level, if you're able to measure that sort of force into it. Now, one of the major differences that I like to sort of hammer home, now this is load dependent. So you can hold a HEMA for, let's say yoga, right? So that would be like a HEMA where you're holding your body position in space. It's not really loaded or anything like that. Now, let's say you had a dumbbells in your hand and you're doing like a lateral raise. So, and you're going to hold for 15, 20 seconds. So let's say you have a mass of 10, like the dumbbell's 10 pounds. So as you start to fatigue, that 10 pounds relative to your fatigue state is actually going to get heavier, right? So the number doesn't change, but your ability to generate force changes, right? So all of a sudden that's going to put you at potential risk, so you can go from an isometric and you could potentially slow her down. So they would call that like a quasi isometric, where it breaks from an isometric now into an eccentrically loaded position. So with that, there becomes a greater chance of joint inflammation as well as risk of injury if you haven't calculated the loads very well. Also, based off the changing location, it's going to change the distance from the axis, so it changes the load. It also is going to change the emphasis of the tissues that you were working a second ago, right? So you're no longer training what you thought you were training before. And let's say you're doing a goblet squat where you're holding the weight in front of you and you're wanting to train your legs, but you got a slight forward lean. Well, that might be emphasizing more your lumbar spine, where you may not have wanted that. And also, what load were you able to hold versus what your legs are capable of generating, right? So, your legs are capable of hundreds of pounds usually, but you're holding a 40-pound dumbbell. So there's going to be this offset of, oh, did I actually pick the right load? So there's all these variables associated with HEMA style training that just make it challenging to actually truly get as good of a benefit as you could. In the PEMA environment, it's always going to match your output in real time. So if you want more load, push harder. And let's say you're pushing, doing a Zercher squat as an example, and I'm driving up into that crossbar. It's going to match the output of your legs. So if it's hundreds of pounds, it's going to go from 0. It's going to hit every degree of like load increase safely, because it's always going to match your output. Thank you, Sir Isaac Newton, right? For basically the third law of motion, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So it's like a proven law of physics, which is cool. But where it gets beneficial is so you can focus on rate of force development, so you can push really hard fast, right? You can push really hard and try to hit your peak force. And then you can actually continue pushing. And what will happen is that you'll come off your peak force, and then you'll be able to actually look at isometric strength endurance while still fixed at that one joint angle, where that's not an option in a HEMA environment, because you push harder, it's going to change the location of where you are. So now I can push harder longer. So in an athletic environment, like if I'm dealing with somebody with, I want to improve my sport performance and power development, and I also want to basically get better at end of game dynamics, because I want to train an athlete in a fatigue state. I can take it from, let's say, 100 pounds to 36 pounds, and I have a 64% drop off in load, but 36 is way harder than 100. So this is actually truly training to maximum. It's not training to the highest number you hit. It's actually training to tissue fatigue, right? So there's that added benefit of taking that HEMA and putting it over there and saying, is there value? Absolutely, there's massive value to it. But what's the outcome we're looking to actually achieve? In an athletic environment, might be power production. So this is better for. If we're looking at injury prevention, this is better for. If we're looking at tendon health, well, if I'm moving a load, I'm moving the emphasis of the tissue I was training. So therefore, tendon effectiveness in like a dynamic world is going to be less effective. If I'm in a HEMA environment, the load might be not good enough. And what we want for tendons, we want longer duration, high intensity, right? Recognizing that intensity is going to drop from a load perspective, but perceived exertion goes up. So it's pretty cool what we can do there. When we're looking at rate of force development, everyone thinks that movement is faster than an isometric. That is untrue. In isometric, you'll elicit the contraction first, because in order to move dynamically, you actually have to have an upregulation of isometric tension first. So subconsciously, you have a thing called anticipatory postural adjustments, where like somewhere else outside of the moving joint has to tighten up first and anchor before you move the dynamic stuff. So subsequently, it's like, oh yeah, never thought about that. So if I actually want to enhance neural drive to said muscle, well, that PEMA environment where I'm pushing really fast, whether they call it a ballistic isometric, right, where I'm looking at rapid force development without movement, well, that's high risk if I'm not prepared for it, right? So I got to layer this stuff appropriately. So if the tendon can't transmit the force because the tendon's compliant, meaning it has the ability to move, can I structure my training in a PEMA environment even, right, where I'm looking at strength endurance or that rate of isometric force fatigue? Can I improve that? Can I improve my peak force? And then only then becomes kind of appropriate to focus on rate of force development, because otherwise I'm shoving with so much force that, to be honest, I could injure my athlete, and we're seeing that kind of across the board. And this is why the educational side behind isometrics is so vital. And a lot of people skip it and go, oh, I got to work on peak force production and I got to work on rate of force development, where it's like, they're important, but there's stages to this. And as I mentioned, there's over 4,000 tendons in the human body. So if you want to optimize performance, maybe focusing on force transmission internally through your muscular system and your structural system is vital. And 1 to 3 seconds is not going to really enhance your tendon structure. And to be honest, it might actually increase the likelihood of tendon irritants and things like, tendinopathies and tendinitis and tendinosis, which is where you get like a little hole within the tendon structure. So if I have inappropriate loading, maybe those become like actually prevalent. So it's about looking at all of that stuff and going, stuff's complicated, even though we're not moving. So thanks for that question. It's a very, very important area as people sort of start to explore isometrics, because they wrap their head around and go, oh yeah, it's isometrics is isometric. It means not moving, but outcomes are totally different.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And I think, as you were saying, like that progression of, I'm not going to go from 0 to 100 and 100 being like, absolute ballistic, pushing in as hard as I can. You want to progress that appropriately. It depends on obviously the setting that you're in, whether that's a rehabilitative setting or, again, an elite performance setting. But again, that progression, kind of like anything, even if you're starting out with working out, you could do like lightweight for higher repetitions, again, that's not too bad, but working on having an appropriate range of motion and being able to, again, sustain a certain range of motion, even for a limited amount of time, that's going to help you be able to handle larger ranges of motion depending on what exercise that you are doing. So I think that progression is very important. And again, dependent upon the setting that you are in.
Not correct. And right now, like if you look across, like, lately across the NFL as well as the NBA, we've had a sort of large increase in Achilles tendon ruptures. And one of the things that you will never hear people talk about is, well, what is the strength of your tibialis posterior? What is the strength of your flexor digitorum longus? What is the, flexor hallucis longus? Like, those are 3 muscles that stabilize the foot structure that has to be stable in order to transmit force for the Achilles to do the job. And all 3 of those muscles I mentioned are plantar flexors. So if we're only focused on one tissue, be it quote unquote the Achilles, or in this case, most people are looking at doing soleus training. Right. So they're looking at, isometrics or soleus training, and they're usually jamming their thigh into a fixed bar and their foot into the ground. So even though it's an isometric, which obviously some will say I have a bias towards, doing a seated calf isometric might be the dumbest thing people can do. And the reason for that in a PEMA environment, right, versus a HEMA, right? So a holding isometric, where the bar is not fixed is safer for calf work than with a fixed bar that you're driving your thigh into. And the reason for that is if you're holding in space, that weight is not actually being compressed down to the femur. When in a PIMA environment, I'm driving my thigh upwards into a fixed bar, and there's tissues at play that I might be destabilizing, squishing is probably a better word, right? Like the distal end of your quadricep, you're jamming a steel bar into, right? It doesn't matter if you got a 1-inch thick pad, it's still not very effective at taking away that discomfort. But the thing that blocks the thing that blocks going up is your femur actually compressing everything between the femur and the actual bar. So there's things that you got to think about, like you got to think about a muscle called articularis genu, which most people have never even heard of, right? And that's basically controls the bursal sac from moving during knee flexion and extension. So if you screw up that muscle, well, maybe your knee's not going to function very well. Well, I'm also pushing my quad tendon into a steel bar and having a shear force going across it. Probably not what I want. The condyles are not symmetrical. So I might be driving one condyle, right? And that's the bone at the portion of the bone at the end of the femur into the tibial plateau. So I might actually increase the likelihood of a lateral meniscal tear, right? And we're starting to see that across basketball a little bit more frequently than we used to in the past, right? That's only the top end. And now the bottom end, if I think about creating a smash burger, right, I got to think about the tendon structure of my foot, right? And if I'm pushing down it because I'm double-ended locked, I don't have my bones and stuff can't move out of the way. So they actually have to cause tissue displacement. So I might be permanently altering my foot structure, right? And that's not good because now my goal of making my soleus stronger, I've destabilized my quad and I've destabilized my foot. So I've effectively dumped more load into my Achilles. And now if you look at most of the injuries, and Adam Petway's got a ton of great research on this. He's probably the leading expert in subject area. But basically what they did is they explored basically all the more recent sort of Achilles ruptures in the NBA, and 100% of them were like basically equated to a false step mechanism. So where they basically step backwards to launch forward. So you get rapid acceleration within that tendon structure. Now, if I destabilize my foot, well, I now have more load going into my Achilles tendon. But what it really comes back to is I couldn't actually manage that isometric component of going one way to transition going to the other way, right? So if I can't control zero velocity in the transitional phase, my inertial mass and my body structure keeps going one way as I'm trying to go the other way. So that's just a recipe for a tear. And you look at that, and that's also applicable to like a pec tear when you're doing bench press as well. When you got the body or the mass going one way as you go to accelerate the other way, right? Mass going one way as I'm even eccentrically loading, I'm still trying to go in a concentric manner because I'm breaking the breaking force of the load. So these are things that people don't think about when it comes to training, and it's like they have to think about them. So this is where you just going through a lot of the programming I had before, like with the resistance training specialist, open doors into insight I just never thought of before. And then from there, living in Google Scholar, it just forces you to think every day like, oh, I never thought about that. That's unique. That's interesting. That's cool. How do I take my said knowledge and revisit a lot of the things that I think are true? And just basically challenge myself daily to sort of say, nah, that's not right. Oh, that is right. But be okay with being wrong. I'm wrong mostly every day. I'm wrong more than I'm right, which is pretty fun, actually. And I challenge people, and like you think about things like mobility training. What happens when you add too much range? What was the end range? Most people don't even think that there is an end range. They just think more range. But yet ballerinas, who are some of the most gifted athletes on the planet, are the most injured. And you wouldn't want their end of life if they've given up their ballet and their training, because they've all elongated their ligaments to a point they're functionally disabled in certain instances. Gymnasts, kind of same thing. They're often injured. And most professional athletes, to be honest, they're some of the most injured people on the planet post-career. So we just got to explore it and be okay with it. So.
No, I completely hear you, and I agree. And I was going to actually kind of touch on that point when you're saying in that article by Adam Pedway, looking at how that false step kind of had basically almost 100% relation to those Achilles injuries. How would you say with isometric training or anything that you're familiar with relating to either ISOPHIT or just in the literature that you've seen relating to, like, say, ankle stiffness and compared to having that flat foot, when you're going backwards but trying to go forwards? How would you say having stiffness, basically keeping that heel up, how would you say that kind of translates to that reduction of injury? Would you say there's any relation with isometrics that you've seen?
I can only speak to our audience that sort of use product as they're supposed to, I guess. What you're able to see is just by focusing on some of the other muscles and changing how you load structure reduces the risk of that horrible scenario I talked about. So instead of doing basically a calf raise as example, where you're driving up into a crossbar or a steel bar, just do it with a plate on your thigh, right? It's going to be a little bit better. Or like, this traditional sort of calf machines that are kind of out there that you basically see the calf machine and just have the end free floating. It makes it a little bit safer. Or you can basically lie down on your back, put your feet actually up on a staircase, if you will, put like the distal end, like the balls of your feet, and just plantar flex and lift your whole body up off the ground. So in essence, this is a stair. This is my calf on top of stair, or my foot on, and now I'm basically working on plantar flexion and not screwing up any of the architecture of my foot. And I'm actually able to get a lot of these other muscles stronger, right? And when I can think about adding more muscles to deal with load, right? It's basically stress sharing, if you will. So if I have one muscle holding 100 pounds, right, there's 100 pounds on that muscle. If I have 10 muscles holding that 100 pounds, arguably it's 10 pounds per muscle. So in essence, I now have a 90-pound gain, from a safety perspective. So I'm able to sort of offload stress. So what we see with isometrics, because you're able to sort of increase the neural activation to, muscles, whether you know the names of them or not. I recommend you do know the names. What you're able to do is strategically add more muscles to handle that load. So when you go to step into that false step, one thing, and it's a complicated situation, right? Because you got body mass moving forward, but the majority of your body mass is actually leaning forward. So you actually put that Achilles under a rapid stress. So if I actually structurally train upper body stuff, right? Because now I have to deal with rotational inertia, and distance matters. So the equation for rotational inertia is mass times radius squared. So if I have a distance further, so it's less about the mass and more about the distance. And if I'm dealing with base or basketball guys, they're tall. So they got a lot of distance going against, their body frame. So what you're able to do is if I actually increase neck strength, like isometrics neck strength, and prevent my body from falling forward so rapidly in an uncontrolled state, I actually take away the stress off my Achilles. So that's something that needs to be explored, and I need smart guys like you to prove me right, from a scientific perspective. Because let's say you're not doing any neck training, as example, right? And we talked a little bit about this before. So you got like two muscles in your, the posterior aspect of your neck and your spine, right? Longissimus cervicus and longissimus capitis. If I look at two of those muscles, right, they go from your occiput, which is the back of your skull, down to T6. And T6 is halfway down your spine. So by choosing to not train your neck, you're choosing to leave 58% of your spine unstable, right? And phrased that way, you go, oh, that doesn't sound very good, right? So if all of a sudden I have my central nervous system within that structure, right? Obviously your brain is within your skull, your eyes, which are part of your central nervous system, and you got your spinal cord, which is all basically unstable because I haven't done anything for them. From a stability perspective, does said neurological signal get there when I'm tired, when I'm fatigued? If you look at Halliburton, he had a pre-existing sort of ankle injury from a couple games before. You could say the thing about KD as well. You could pick a guy. Most basketball people have an ankle thing going on already. So those are some things I have to think about. Like, what are the muscles that stabilize said structure, and not just talk about my Achilles. My Achilles, you're looking at soleus, gastroc, and plantaris, Nobody talks about the plantaris because it's a small muscle, but it also attaches to the Achilles. So all of those variables are going to matter in the conversation, where we're just solely like mono focused on, oh, we got to focus on the Achilles. No, the Achilles just proved it did too much work. It was handling too much load, and that's why it tore, right? So change how we talk about the conversation. You know, when I can look at all the sort of other tissues associated with plantar flexion, why aren't we talking about them? You know, the easiest way to reduce stress on the Achilles is to get the other ones to do more work. And we're not training them. We're not, you know, as I said, we're not talking about them. So if they're not part of the conversation, we don't think about it. So let's make them part of the conversation. So, yeah, I think it's really easy, to be honest, to resolve Achilles ruptures personally. But that's to be determined.
Definitely. And I mean, you know, it's always with injuries, you never know, accidents do happen, but, you know, finding ways to, again, as you said, kind of restructure the conversation, think about the inherent musculature surrounding certain important ligaments and tendons, and trying to find ways to, you know, keep it well-rounded and strengthen those structures around that. You know, that's a good way to start and try to help, you know, mitigate those injury risks that could occur.
Well, and that's the thing, right? Like, once you start to explore structural anatomy, you see that there's more muscles that we might be forgetting. What happens when we get those ones we're forgetting stronger? Well, like literally, your body has the ability to tolerate more force because more things are doing stuff. And if I can increase force tolerance, and we all know that obviously injuries are multifactorial, as they like to say, but really they're not. You can simplify it by saying basically force exceeded tolerance. Now, what led to the inability to tolerate it? I mean, that's, you know, you can have a bubble of, you know, a trillion different things. But at that instantaneous moment in time, it was you couldn't tolerate the force. And what happened is that at an instantaneous moment of time, tissue displacement occurred. And what is the opposite of tissue displacement? Isometric, right? So if I'm looking at upregulating isometric tension instantly at that moment of time, and I haven't trained it, well, it's a recipe for disaster. You know, so those are some things that we just have to think about. And if I'm strategically shutting down other tissues that I didn't think about, right? And there was a really kind of cool study that came out, I think it was a couple of years ago, but they looked at a single dude. He injured his ankle. But what they basically did was they MRI'd him up the yin yang to figure out, oh, well, basically you put your 18 days later, what actually happens from a tissue perspective, from an atrophy perspective, from a tissue dominance perspective. So injured ankle, I put him in a boot. So 18 days later, his bicep femoris increased in volume by 8%. Semimembranosus decreased in volume by 15%. His soleus increased in size. His popliteus, his soleus reduced. His popliteus increased in size and function. So there's all of these things because on injury, structural adaptation still occurs. It may not have been what you thought it was, right? And we take the boot off and we go, let's just do some specific exercises. But we may not be thinking that there was basically a 24% shift in, you know, hamstring function because I hurt my ankle, you know, because you just didn't think about it. So now it's kind of like when you think about stuff like that, oh, okay, well, maybe other things are adaptively shortening or changing or altering when I offset load. And you know how fast and rapid the human structure adapts. I mean, you're looking at like 3 days before you start losing gym gains, right, from a hypertrophy perspective. So that's not even injured, right? Like, you know, if you look at Achilles ruptures, let's go ACL ruptures, you're looking at a 30% force loss of your quadricep within the first 10 days. You know, so how is that going to influence walking mechanics, you know, if you're able to walk? How is that going to influence pelvic position alignment? How is that going to affect, you know, you're probably going to not do much. So you're now bedridden. So now what are the shear forces going against your structure? What's that going to relate to in the coming weeks? So once again, just how do we focus about all of this stuff? And it's just like, keep your head in the book, you know, keep learning, keep applying that knowledge and actually have applied knowledge, right? You have to actually test this stuff, and we do see across the board that, injury rates with our customers go down, which is kind of cool. And I think that's why people keep calling us. We increase durability. And in the world of sport performance, that's the only thing that matters, to be honest. Outcome and durability. So, yeah, so very, very fortunate in that sense. So.
Awesome. And I think you said that very well. Like, availability is really, really critical in many different settings. But I don't want to hold you for too long. I did have a few more questions just for you. And these are kind of questions, a little less about isometrics, but kind of more about just you and your own opinions on a few things. My first question is, right now, how has fitness influenced your life overall?
Oh man, it's the only thing I've ever done. Fitness is my life. There's no other way to describe it. I got into exercise. I went to school for exercise science, basically, because it was the only thing I was good at. I wasn't the greatest scholastic guy on the planet, I'll tell you that. And fitness probably kept me out of prison. Sport, and another sort of avenue. So I used to be a goon in lacrosse, so I was allowed 3 fights a game. I was a highly aggressive kid because I had a lot of head trauma as a young kid through concussions for various things. So, so that basically gave me a pathway, and then it gave me the confidence. And then eventually I got the knowledge to go with that confidence, to be able to have conversations with people. And then I'm not going to lie, it's like in 2017, I had the U.S. Army call me. Like, I'm a small town farm kid, and the U.S. Army's calling me about my product. Like, this is blowing my mind. Like, that's, so I've lived a life that's far exceeded any expectation I've ever had. And it's all because of fitness. It's all because I'm able to help people every day. And one interesting thing, and you may not know this story, I often talk about my initial funding for ISOPHIT. So my daughter, who was born premature, she was born at 28 weeks, 5 days, weighing 2 pounds, 12 ounces. And this is when I was going through all the patenting sort of section. So very expensive sort of proposition, if you will. So I get my legal bill, and my daughter's in the NICU. She's 2 pounds, 12 ounces, as I said. So she's been there for like a couple weeks now. And I get basically a phone call from my patent lawyer and says, "Hey, Brad, I just want to let you know your patent application's ready. We're about to file, and I hope you're sitting down because we've had some overruns on, basically the cost structure." And I was told there's going to be $15,000-$20,000, and at that point, I had like $25,000 in my bank account, burned through that. But when my daughter came, so she was 3 months early, and we had some overruns and stuff like that. So my patent lawyer goes to me and says, "Hey, Brad, I just want to let you know, like, your bill's $47,000. And I'm like, oh, okay. So daughter's in the NICU. My wife just lost her business because the kid came 3 months early. And I'm running a studio as well. So I'm not at work because I'm looking after my wife, who's got vertigo at home, and my kid. And so I post to Facebook basically saying how screwed I am. And I get a phone call within 15 minutes. And, it's a former personal training client I hadn't talked to in a couple of years. And she says, "Hey, Brad, I just want to let you know, I got a check here for $100,000. I'm going to drop it off on Monday, and everything's going to be okay." So that's personal training. That's when you have influence of other people's lives. Sometimes it comes back to you, 100,000 fold, if you will. And it's like, didn't ask her. And to be honest, I hadn't talked to her in several years. So it wasn't like like this client who I saw like 5 days a week. It was just somebody I influenced a couple of years before, and she saw that I needed help, and subsequently she was in a position to help. And so when people get to know who I am, when I let that kind of guard down a little bit, the only thing I care about is helping people. That is the absolute only thing I care about. The money, I don't care about the money so much. It's not a motivating factor. Being able to see somebody who had died, and I'm able to help them function better because they came out of their coma and they're looking at re-educating their muscular system, and we're able to help influence that. It is so empowering. And then, it's pretty cool to watch my athletes every day, on TV and stuff like that. And, we're in Hollywood as well. So watching Netflix stars, and I know, use our product, which is the coolest thing on the planet. But it only comes back to, I was in a position of needing help. and a dire position in needing help. And there was an angel, if you will, and they call them angel investors. And she showed up on Monday. She hands me a check for $100,000, and she's walking away. And then she stops and she goes, "Oh, what do I get for this?" It wasn't even a concern of hers. She just wanted to help. So I said, "Hey, 10%." She's like, "Perfect." So I had an instantaneous $1 million valuation out of a Facebook post, all because I'm a personal trainer who helps somebody. It baffles my mind. So A, I will never give up. B, I will never stop. I'm the most relentless person because I would never want to disappoint this individual. And that's not to say that I will not fail. I have failed every day. I will just not give up. And, you look at it and people are like, "You're still doing this?" I'm like, hell's yes. I'm never going to stop. And I have I get contacted these days by, what do you call those, venture capitalist firms. And the first question is, "Oh, what's your exit strategy?" I usually hang up the phone. I have no exit strategy. I'm not giving up. It's not about the money. I don't if you offer me $100 million, I'd be like, okay, I'll take that. However, that's not what they're offering. But even then I would just figure out, how do I help humans with that 100 million? I'd be very philanthropic. So it just comes back to, how do I help people? And, what was it? Simon Sinek sort of came out a couple of years ago. It's like, what's your why? It's like, so everyone's trying to figure out what their why. Well, mine's to create health, change lives, and give back. That's what I do every day. I'm fortunate enough to live my why. So it's pretty cool. So, yeah. So that's what fitness has given to me. And I travel the world too much. So I'm hoping to not travel so much in this coming year, because the last 2 years I've been on the road 15 months out of 24. So it's too much when you have a wife you love and a kid you love. So, so it comes with sacrifice as well.
That's awesome. And I think kind of to that point, I have just two more questions for you, but I think to that point that you were kind of getting to, I think wealth is such a mindset. Some people think that, money is magic, and it's something that, you need so much of. But then when you get to the point of, at the end of the day, you might not be here tomorrow. You might not be here in the next couple of minutes. But the thing is that the impact that you leave on someone, that transcends anything, any amount of money. That impact that you can have on someone and that someone can have on you, that not only the feeling, but the way that it can actually change your life and how you go about your life. I think that's so valuable. And I think that story that you kind of give, and thank you for sharing that. I think that's so important. So important.
Yeah. And it's like, there's a time a couple of years ago, I went to an event down in Katy, Texas, right? So a small town outside of, or small city outside of Houston. And I walk into Proactive Lifestyle Fitness, where they have some of our products. And this gentleman was standing there waiting for me. He walks up and he gives me a big giant hug, and he's in tears. And I'm like, okay, this seems a little weird. He's like, "You changed my life." And I'm like, "I just met you." He's like, "Well, ISOPHIT changed my life. I used to be addicted to drugs because I was in chronic pain, and this helped me get out of chronic pain. So I'm no longer on the drugs." And it's just like, so literally this changed that man's life. And it was just like, what? And that's what I walk into. And it's like, that's really, really, really freaking cool. And it's highly addictive, helping people. And when you the amount of stories that I have, and I will write books about this, because I think people need to hear about this journey. But yeah, it's like, I was talking to a lady before I got on the phone, like she works with people with Parkinson's disease. They're doing better, and obviously I work with the athletes. They're doing better. Arkansas won yesterday, their second title in 50 years for the SEC, right? So I look at some of the sport organizations we see where, got multiple teams on the women's side in the top three, teams in the country. And I was like, well, that's kind of cool. And then we look in the men's side, it's like, okay, we've now just won the SEC, and, and that's a component of everything they do. But it's a component that I think, if used well, increases the odds of winning, because your best players are on the court longer. Or if you're coming out of coma, well, you've been bedridden for days, your muscular system hasn't worked. So is standing up and walking around the most appropriate? Or is learning to contract tissue better? I think learning to contract tissue first, then move, right? So just adding that one step, it's transformative. And, what we see, like I was working with this one guy, Sarkis, he had stroke, died, rehabilitated to a degree, but still wheelchair bound, still unable to sort of stand. After our first session, we increased his ability to stand unsupported by 275% in one session, right? And it's just because we are able to affect the nervous system that fast, right? With isometrics, that is not available doing dynamics. It's just not. And it's just, once again, it's like, that's just really, really cool. So as I said, very, very fortunate. So sorry to take so much time.
No, you're good. Thank you for telling everything about your stories, and that's really impactful, truly. One other question that I have before I ask everybody where you can find you, what does it mean to you to love your life and to live your life?
Man, well, technically, so I live in a world of self-deprecation a fair bit. I challenge myself so much daily. Like, I wake up every day thinking, how do I not fail today? That's kind of the goal. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I fail quite a lot. But tomorrow morning, I will wake up with a brand new, fresh start going, okay, well, we get to play the same game today. So I love every aspect of my life, to be honest. Like, I have a great family. I have a great business. I have unbelievable opportunity. And realistically, and I judge, how I live my life is, if I were to die right now, am I satisfied? The answer is yes. I've lived in a life of abundance, and that's good and bad. But I recognize that the good is better by some of the bad crap I've gone through. And when you're an entrepreneur, there's some stuff you're going to see every day that you just facing bankruptcy, the financial stress of creditors phoning you for years. But it's like tunnel vision. It's like, okay, push away the noise. I'm on a mission. I got to get to the starting line. And I used to always say, I got to get to the starting line. I'm now in the game. And it's like, okay, keep pushing forward. I got to get to the end of the game. And so when you're looking at, just be honest with yourself. Recognize it. Don't take it too damn serious, because you're going to fail. You're going to be judged. And then, to be honest, the person judging you is you, because most people are judging themselves. They're not even paying attention to you. And you can walk down the street, and I like to believe that I've had some impact on this world, and I can walk to the corner store and nobody knows who the hell I am. So it's kind of nice. And, recently we just started watching this JFK Jr. TV show, and, there's the paparazzi around taking photographs. I would not want that life in a million years. I like people not knowing who the hell I am. I like being able to sort of show up and sort of say, hey, I can help you. This is how I can help you. And then I can retreat back to my life of sitting either on my couch or in my bed, because those are my offices when I'm not on the road, So it's like I live a life, I think, that is well within my means, below my means, I guess, to a degree. And it's like, I picked up my first car as example. The first time I ever bought a car is 47 years of age. I never owned a car in my life, but because of COVID, I thought I needed a car, which now I have a car that sort of sits there and my wife drives a lot. But it's like one of those things. It's like, I didn't need a car, so why buy it? But that's the level of practicality I live. But yeah, to basically love my life, I'm fortunate in the sense that I do actually enjoy myself. I enjoy my space. I enjoy the path I'm on, and to be able to help people, as I said, there's nothing greater in life to be able to be of service to individuals, to be honest, I've never even met and talked to. So pretty cool.
That's really cool. And I think that's awesome, being able to, enjoy the life that you live, keep the space that you have for, outside of everything, keep that tunnel vision, but also be able to appreciate the things around you, your family that you have, and just the life that you've come from any mistakes that you've made in the past to the gains that you're trying to make on a daily basis. So that's awesome.
That's pretty cool. I'm not gonna lie.
So thank you again for just being on this podcast today. But before you leave, I just want to say, and if you want to let the audience know, where are the best places that they can reach you or find you, feel free to share as much as you need.
Best place is probably Instagram. So, my handle is at ISOPHIT_Inventor, and ISOPHIT is PHIT, not FIT. You have there, I put out an article every day on Substack, and it's free. And it's always about isometrics. And so if you're wanting to learn more about the subject area, we have 300 I missed yesterday, which was the first time in the last, since March 21st last year, because I was at a conference all weekend and I was working on my presentation. So it bugged me that I missed it. But basically we have over 350 consecutive articles on isometrics. And it ranges from subject areas from neural cognition to sport performance. Today's was basically on inertial effects and basically rotational inertia and how dynamic exercises increases your risk of joint injuries, and how isometrics can help mitigate those risks. So that's if you go to substack.com, and the handle is at ISOPHIT. And also on LinkedIn, I post a ton on LinkedIn as well. And then my personal email is Brad, BRAD, @isophit.com. If you got a question, just email me. Happy to answer it.
Some great. Well, thank you, Brad, for coming on today. And I appreciate the wealth of knowledge that you've kind of just provided to everyone in terms of like your experiences, the experience in terms of like working as a personal trainer, the conversations and how your business has been leveraging itself in different ways with different audiences, as well as just the fact that, you're a normal guy, you're working daily, as well as that you take time for the things that matter important to your life, while also doing the things that you love. So thank you again, Brad, for coming on today. Really appreciate it.
Angela, thank you for the opportunity, man. And good luck with this, because I think you're going somewhere.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. I also want to thank our wonderful guests for coming on today. For more content, you can find us on Instagram at Love Life, Live Life Fitness. Stay tuned for our next episode. And as always, love your life and live your life.